sometimes they're really small traditions. Those really small things that gets passed on from generation to generation or from friend to friend. Like in some households, there's a tradition that nobody really speaks. They may mumble, but they don't really speak until everybody has had the first cup of coffee. Or such big traditions that last days, like if a family hikes to the Boundary Waters to celebrate birthdays or has an elaborate family meal that they plan for 2 weeks in advance in the holidays. Everybody has their traditions. We have our traditions at church and at home and out in community too. I know one woman who had this very interesting experience with traditions. Her family always made fudge at Christmas. Simple tradition. But they didn't really have many other Christmas traditions. They were one of those families that make good Norwegian Swedes go, "What are you doing?" Because they celebrated Christmas whenever it happened to fit in between their parties. And sometimes they had a tree, and sometimes they had stockings, and sometimes they didn't. And it might have been a different tree from last year, depending on what was on sale. And sometimes they made a special meal at home with their family, and sometimes their special meal was sandwiches on the boat at the lake. Some years they went to church, some years they didn't, some years they went to church the Sunday after because there just wasn't nearly as many crowds then. They had to be the most flexible people when it came to celebrating Christmas that I have ever known. But the one thing that they did every year in the middle of December was to make fudge. That was their one thing. They made several of these huge batches of fudge so that it would last all the way through the middle of January. And they would have it available to be part of the parties and whoever stopped over and their celebrations. And sometimes it wouldn't get made until closer to the actual day. But by Christmas Day, even if they had to stay up all night, they had their fudge made. And so the daughter of this family, as many teenagers do, thought that their family's way of doing things was just the way the world worked. Hadn't thought of anything different. She knew that some people were more picky about their family time or their church time than her family was. But it had never occurred to her, seriously never occurred to her that fudge was optional at Christmas. Everybody in the world made fudge at Christmas, or at least everybody in the United States. To her, it is what made December 25th into a celebration of new life and hope in Christ, and not just another day on the calendar. Then, as soon as she finished high school, she got married. And she happened to marry into a family that, number one, did not know how to make fudge, number two, did not like fudge, and number three, did not associate fudge with Christmas. So this young bride, trying to make her in-laws happy, and they had this list of traditions longer than this room, but none of them included fudge. She's trying to make a good impression on her mother-in-law and trying to learn all of these new things, which aren't any big deal to her whatsoever, because she could jump into whatever anybody was doing at Christmas time, most flexible Christmas family in the world. But she didn't understand why they didn't change every year. But she did understand that they didn't change, and so she respected that. But she also tried to make fudge. She thought it was her job. And so she'd gather up all the ingredients for a month before and buy stuff on sale, and she'd try to find the time to make it work between all of the other activities in the season. But she continually found herself making fudge at midnight or getting up at 3 in the morning. And when it was done, nobody would really eat it, except the people who happened to stop by from her side of the family. And she kept seeing her bowls of fudge untouched, and she would ask what was wrong with it. Oh, did that batch not turn out well? Is there something, what happened? And she'd get all kinds of answers, very polite answers about how there may be a different kind of chocolate, or I'm used to nuts in my fudge, or I just can't have that much sugar. And so, year after year, she learned new techniques for making fudge. And pretty soon, they had a whole table full of fudge. Light chocolate, dark chocolate, marshmallow cream from scratch, nuts, not nuts, low sugar, and it just went on and on. And the fudge was still basically untouched. And not only that, people started asking her why she was exhausting herself making all this candy. And she would answer the only truth that she knew. She would say, because it's Christmas. And that's where the conversation would end. With complete miscommunication on both sides, for many years longer than Molly would like to admit, the cycle continued every December. Her tradition gave her family meaning. It was a way they found their joy and set the season apart for hope and peace as being different from the rest of the year. It certainly wasn't the most important thing about the season, for sure, but it was a way her family had found helpful. And therefore, it was important to them, and it was important to her. And they'd been doing it that way for so long that she thought that it was just the way the world worked. And when somebody questioned it, she felt lost and upset. How could it be Christmas without fudge? And on the other hand, the making of fudge was not a tradition that her in-laws had found meaningful. It wasn't part of their history. It wasn't part of their plans because it didn't have value to them. And they thought that the way they did it was just the way the world worked. They'd been passing along their tradition and making their list of traditions longer for so many generations. And so all these things, anything that we pass along from one person to another, from one generation to another, those are our traditions. And we probably have more of them than we ever think about. And although we have to give some credit to those scribes and Pharisees for asking about their tradition, not only were they gathered around Jesus, but they were open enough to ask Jesus what was going on instead of just going off and condemning him and saying, doesn't he understand the way the world works? This is how we do things. This is how our elders did things. This is the tradition. Now, we don't know what spirit they ask that in, because sometimes a question is a question, and sometimes a question is an attack. And Jesus definitely responds with a sharp tongue to their question. And that makes a little bit more sense when we put it in the bigger picture of how those same scribes and Pharisees were encouraging something called Corban, or Korban, never quite sure how to pronounce that, which is where they encouraged people to give everything that they had to the temple. And then there was nothing left to take care of the widows, their elderly family members, the orphans, all of those people who needed care. And so they were making the temple rich by taking care away from the least of those in the society, and especially the least of those that these people had promised to take care of, their own elders. And so not only was it hand washing and pot washing and which foods from the market, but it was, do your parents have something to eat? No Social Security back then. But, so when Jesus answers this question of tradition and saying it's about God's love, it's about who God calls you to be and not just the human precepts. This idea of ritual hand washing being important had been around for a long, long time. It gave people's lives this sense of rhythm, a sense of the sacred. It was something they did to refocus themselves on God several times a day. They found it meaningful in their lives. And they'd been doing it for so long that it seemed exceedingly odd that anybody would consider doing anything ever in a different way. Especially these people who were fellow Jews, devoted Jews, even if not in the same way as the scribes and the Pharisees. And so they questioned. They said, "What are they doing? This isn't the way the world works. You know the traditions. You know how this is supposed to happen." And Jesus said, "Well, what's that tradition all about? What are we doing with it?" But the thing that I think is interesting is that Jesus does not really condemn tradition. He just said, you've been teaching human precepts instead of teaching about God's love, God's law. You got to remember when they pull up the word law that's all of the teachings, not just the 10 Commandments. You've been focusing on the human too much. You've been focusing on these structures that you have found helpful instead of the reason that you have these structures. And I really like the fact that this story got included because this happens to us too. Whether it happens to us with our fudge making at Christmas or on the other side of the family, the 12 kinds of potatoes. I don't know if it was actually 12, but they always joked that it was 12 kinds of potatoes that they had to have at Christmas. Or whether it's what we do on Saturday mornings, or if it's how we worship, or how we come together as a community outside of worship, whatever it is, the structures of our living faith live right along with us. It's all about God's love, and we've been given these things that work for us, for the most part. We have all these traditions, and we wouldn't keep doing them if they weren't a way that we knew God's love, God's grace, and God's mercy through all of these traditions that are just human traditions. And then we have all the ways that we live out our faith, all the ways that we care for others, all the ways that we let other people know about God's love. Those are traditions too. There can be very different ways of doing those things. But we found these to be helpful. We found that these point us back to God. So when we have things that point us back to God, those are good traditions. When we have things that point us away from God or point back into themselves of tradition for tradition's sake, that's not so good. And Jesus calls out the Pharisees on that, for the hand washing of being tradition for tradition's sake and the Korban for pointing directly away from God. And so this week, as we look at all the traditions in our lives, as we notice which structures are really, really helpful for us knowing God's love and which structures are maybe not so much, things that have outlived their lifetime, as we do that, as we think about all of the ways this plays out in our lives, may you find a blessing in those traditions that God has handed on to you through all of your brothers and sisters. And may you find awe in all the traditions of all the people around you, because there are a lot of them and they are extremely varied. It's amazing how God works through different people in different ways to give value and meaning to their lives and make a structure where they can know God's love. and new life and mercy and forgiveness. And may you be at peace, knowing that God works in more ways than you can possibly know or understand, helping our traditions be living traditions in the new life that God gives us, that our traditions live right along with us, continuing to become, always becoming a place where we can know God's love more fully. Amen.